Move on to agenda item 3. We have 2 speakers. If our next 2 speakers would like to come to the table, Mr. Mac Taylor, Jerry Nicholsberg. We will begin with Mr. Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst. He will be giving us an overview of the economy, including information on 3 themes: small businesses, development, federal funding, and trade and foreign investment. And so, Mr. Taylor, just a little bit of background, was appointed to the position of legislative analyst in 2008 and has had a 30-year career as a fiscal and policy advisor. As legislative analyst, he oversees the preparation of nonpartisan analysis of the state's budget and programs and is also responsible for preparing impartial analysis of all initiatives and constitutional measures qualifying for the state ballot. Mr. Taylor, thank you for joining us. Please begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members. It's very nice to be here today. Handouts being passed around right now that I'm going to go through. As you noted, I was asked to focus on 3 things: sort of an overview of the economy, some comments about small businesses, and federal funds and the impact on the state. It's a fairly high-level review. I'm glad that you have real experts like Mr. Nicholsberg next to me who can answer the questions in more detail about certain things about the California economy. But at least let me give you that sort of general context in which to perhaps put your other speakers' comments into perspective. So starting on page 2, everybody loves a top 10 list. And if you were to take California's output, our gross domestic output, the value of the goods and services that are produced in the states, and you compared them with the other nations of the world, we would be 8th currently. In fact, some people think that we're pretty close to passing Brazil and become 7th. But the point is not really a game about how high we can go. It's really just to show that California is an economic powerhouse. Not only important for the U.S. economy, but for the world economy. We put out about $2.2 trillion, our total output. The next biggest state is Texas at about $1.5 trillion. So just give you some perspective of how large we are. On page 3, I know this is a little bit hard to see, but what we try to show is for these various sectors, whether it's trade, construction, finance, how does the state compare with the United States as a whole? And not surprisingly, given how big we are, we reflect the country too because we're so large. But if the size of the bubbles just show that, really we have a very diverse economy. We're not highly dependent upon, say, autos, as Michigan was, or oil industry, as certain states are, Alaska or North Dakota. We have a very diverse economy, and that helps you, obviously. You don't experience the sort of volatility in the economy that, for example, we realize in our revenue structure, because we are a fairly diverse economy. If you turn to page 4, this, I think, for me, is one of my favorite pictures of describing what happened over the last 7 years. And it tells you both about the depth of the Great Recession and why it's taken us so long to pop out of it. If you go down the page, what it shows is how many jobs did we lose, and it compares it with the prior 2 recessions. So if you take the dark blue line, that's the recent recession we just went through, the Great Recession. And if you go down the page, you can see we lost almost 9% of our jobs. That's just astounding. Nothing like that since the Great Depression. And you compare it with the prior 2 recessions, you see how much greater that impact was on jobs. If you go from the left to right, that tells you, well, how long did it take you to bounce back, to get to the point where you had the same level of jobs that you had before the start of the recession? And you can see it took us, and we just got back just a few months ago, it took us about 7 years to just recoup the same number of jobs. On the next page, some information that relates to what the prior speaker was referring to, the importance of trade to the California economy. On the left side of the page, you can see where do we ship our goods, and this is physical goods. This does not include services. But you can see the European Union is our #1 export. After that, it's either our neighbors, Mexico or Canada, or it's Asia. And then on the right-hand side of the page, you can just see of the total amount of goods that we export, what are some of the larger categories. On the next page, just wanted to include something about poverty. It's obviously getting a lot of attention. There are different ways that you can measure poverty. On the left-hand side of the page is the historical basis, the official poverty measure. And you can see that we don't differ too much from the rest of the nation if you use that measure. There's been a new indicator that's come out recently. It's called the Research Supplemental Poverty Measure. And it tried to take into account some of the non-cash payments that low-income people can receive. But it also did something that resulted in a large contributor to what you see on the right-hand side of the page, where we're much higher than the rest of the nation. It adjusted for housing costs. And that results in California having a much higher proportion of people that are classified as low income. Now, if you turn to the next page, you'll see, well, sort of just another take on that. This compares how Californians spend the proportion of their income that they spend on their housing cost. And if you look down at the bottom of the page there, you see all other states' metro areas. It's about 23% on average of what people spend on their housing. And you can see for all of California's major metro areas, we spend considerably more. We have a very, very high housing cost in the state. The next page just really adds a little bit more to that story. And, since 2002, you see the cumulative effect of housing costs. They grew very rapidly during the early 2000s, leading to the collapse of our financial and housing markets in 2007-8 period. Housing costs have dropped since then. They're still higher than they were in 2002. But you can see that cumulatively, housing costs have still grown faster than median household income, which means that you're then paying a lot more for your housing. The next chart on page 9 is one of my favorites and probably reflects my budgetary emphasis that I have in my job. But this is just one aspect of demographics, age. And what it shows is over this current decade, what we expect to happen in the size of these various population cohorts. And it really tells you three fairly distinct stories. If you look on the left-hand side of the page, you see the red bars, that the 0 to 17 group is actually declining over this period, as is the 18 to 24. And from a budgeting perspective, most of you know, I think, how much of our budget we spend on education. It's over half. And so you have the two key components of your budget, 0 to 17 or K-12 is in there, which is not growing at all. It's declining slightly. And your college age, which you're very concerned about, is also declining even more rapidly. Now, what that means is it's really good for your budgetary situation because you don't have to spend a lot of money just to keep up with the growing population, build more schools, take care of new kids from a statewide basis now. You can spend it for other things. You can either improve your programs or you can increase your participation rates in college, but you don't have those underlying just basic demographic pressures. So that's actually good news for your budget. The middle part of the bars, those are your wage earners, your key times when people are earning their money, particularly the 45 to 64. And so you have some relatively small growth in that size. And then you see on the right-hand side of the page what's happening with our seniors that Ms. Brown referred to. And I think my hair is silvery enough to qualify, Assemblywoman? I think I'm okay. Surprisingly, though, this does not have a huge effect on the state budget, as one might think. This is really the federal budget of Medicare and Social Security. I'm not to say that seniors don't drive some of our costs. In Medi-Cal, we have skilled nursing facilities where it does contribute. But most of our budget is not that senior-driven. This is much more of a federal budget problem. So then just closing off on this first part, key issues affecting the state economy. Obviously, there's many things you're going to be talking about that have already come up. Again, maybe this reflects my bias, and one thing I didn't put in there is education, again, obviously, is you're investing in people, in their value, their ability to contribute to the economy. But infrastructure is one that I think is one of the most important governmental functions. You're providing these public goods that otherwise won't be provided, and whether it's your university facilities, your school facilities, your water, your roads, your electricity grid, things where the government has to take actions to make sure that these are provided, and they're crucial for businesses. It's your sort of foundational things that you have to have if business is going to function well. And so I would have to say on infrastructure, we don't do as good a job as we should. We have a 5-year infrastructure plan that the governor puts out every year, but we don't really follow through on it. The legislature does not have a strong sort of planning process and a way of making sure that you're spending your limited funds in the most effective way. You spend about $10 billion a year on average on infrastructure. And you need to make sure that you're, one, are you using local government resources efficiently? Are you using private, where there are private benefits? Are you making sure that the private sector is paying for those? Are you leveraging federal funds? Are you using demand management? Are you making sure that you're getting the cost structures right and the incentives right? But it's just a crucial issue. And the governor has highlighted two particular aspects in his current budget. One is transportation. He wants to have perhaps a different way of funding the maintenance of our roads, and that is critical. Our roads are not in good shape, and they're getting worse. And given the way that we levy our gas taxes on a per gallon basis, we probably should review how we want to fund our roads. Water, obviously, with the water bond is critically important now. With the drought, the governor's proposing over $500 million from the water bond to be spent this year. I've already talked about housing costs, a crucial issue, though. In some ways, not completely in your control, or if you could argue largely in your control. Local government has a crucial role to play in making sure that housing is available for folks. And regulations, the non-budget aspect. Regulations are crucial for business. And it's not a matter of you shouldn't pass regulations. It's just you want to always make sure that they're smart, that they have good returns, that they're being efficiently done, they're not excessive, that they're easy for business to follow. So the non-budget aspect is, in some ways, just as important, I think, to business as what happens in the budget. In some ways, it can be more important to them. So very quickly on small business, I won't spend too much time on these since your first speaker did, but on the chart on page 12, she talked about how the overwhelming number of businesses are small businesses. But of course, a lot of employees still are in larger businesses, and this just shows you how they're distributed by the size of the business. And you can see that half of the employees in California are in larger firms, 500 or more. And then you can see by size division there, the 1 to 19, who some people would consider really small businesses, make up about a fifth of the employees are in those small businesses. And it's really important that we do have different ways of characterizing small businesses. Sometimes it's by size, sometimes it's by the amount of their output, their gross business receipts, or things like that. And there's appropriately different ways to categorize small business. The next page just shows you some of these 1 to 19, these very small businesses, where are they located. It's actually distributed through the sectors very well, so it's not quite as interesting a story as I thought it might be. So let's move to page 14. How does the state deal with small businesses? Well, as far as direct spending, like what we provide for them in particular, it's not a whole lot. We have the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, or GoBiz, and there is where your programs are primarily focused. They have a tax credit program in which they set aside a fourth of their tax credit value for small businesses. They have a small business advocate office which tries to help small businesses in general. And then they run a small business loan guarantee program that's a long-standing state program. Again, they don't actually lend the money, but they guarantee small banks lending to those businesses. The state has had a long-standing practice to provide procurement benefits. They give a 5% typically bid preference for small businesses, so they're not guaranteed any particular level of the value of the contracts, but they're given a preference that helps them compete against larger firms. On page 15, very quickly, so what do you need to sort of think about as you deal with bills and the budget that might affect small businesses? I think you're historically very good about taking into account the fact that small businesses, it's more difficult for them to deal with regulations and requirements. Most things that you pass, you will provide exemptions for businesses of less than 50 or less than 25, whether it's a compensation improvement like medical leave or family leave, things like that. You typically will put an exemption. I think that's smart. Small businesses do not have the administrative staff, the legal staff, to deal with these things as larger businesses too. It's a much higher percentage of their receipts and business costs. So I think it's very appropriate in that way to think about how your regulations and your requirements affect them, because it's going to be much more impactful on them than it is on a medium or larger sized businesses. In some ways, a lot of this is, again, out of your control in large part because local governments are so crucial to business formation. It's the local government they typically have to go to get their business license. They may have to pay a tax to start up. They have to deal with zoning issues. They have to deal with various other things at the local level. So local government is a crucial aspect of this sort of whole mix. Finally, I was asked to just chat a little bit about federal funds. And on page 17, first of all, it's important to know that a lot of funds come into the state, and only a small part of that, or a small proportion, actually goes through the state budget. So this tries to show you what are just all the monies that come into the state from the federal government. These could be checks paid for Social Security. It could be payments to military personnel on an installation, a contract of a defense, a contractor, payments to them. So this just gives you a very brief overview. In 12-13, had about $350 billion come into the state. Largely the Social Security Medicare is a third of it. Defense is about a fifth. Defense would have been much bigger if we were looking at this back in 1990, a much smaller proportion now. But it gives you a sense of what are the areas that the dollars are flowing back into the state. And then on the next page of that sort of 350, it's a different year. The governor's budget has, for 15-16, that about $100 billion in federal dollars will flow through the state budget. That is, we specifically appropriate those funds. If you're on the budget committee, you actually will have that in your budget bill that we appropriate them. Far and away, the most money is in health, and this has grown dramatically with the federal health care reform. A huge increase in the amount of federal dollars coming into the state. But you have other things. You have education. Those dollars are for special ed, nutrition, where the federal government has a strong financing role, social services, where they match our spending on various, again, social service programs. A lot of people like to talk about how does California do relative to other states on federal funds. On page 19, we're about 37th. These numbers are always 2 or 3 years old, but we were 37th in per capita federal spending. We do very poorly on retirement benefits. I think that's largely due to the fact that we have a younger population. We have a lot of people that probably don't earn enough quarters to qualify for Social Security, so they don't get the payments, or that some people, leave to go retire elsewhere, whatever. But we don't do well on that. On other categories, we're about average. I think you'll hear a lot more about, well, California only returns much less than $1 of the amount that it sends to Washington. And it's true. We're usually about 79 cents, 80 cents on the dollar. But it's not surprising, because the federal government funds their programs through income taxes and corporate taxes. And California is a very well-to-do state, or a high personal income state. So the whole point is to redistribute funds, and California, in effect, is redistributing to other states. So the fact that we're less than $1 is really not surprising. That's intentional. But we don't do well, so we're about 79 cents on the dollar. Well, I was asked to just comment briefly, well, how do we ensure that we maximize federal dollars coming into the state? And for the most part, if you're talking about federal programs, individual state departments are responsible, and in fact are directed by the budget, to make sure that they're maximizing the amount of federal funds for which we're eligible. And it's basically through those state agencies that we achieve that. Now, there are other ways. If you want to just bring in more dollars in the state, there are ways to bring in more federal dollars. They just have different consequences. For example, we have many programs where we have matched costs. That is, they provide $1 for our dollar. If you increase the cost of your IHSS program, for whatever reason, you want to increase service or hours, you can do that and you'll get more federal dollars. It's just that you'll have to also match those. So there's a state general fund cost to those. There are some programs that are almost entirely federal funded. And one that a lot of people like to refer to as CalFresh, or the former food stamps program. It's almost entirely federal funded. And some people think that, well, not only could we, there's a lot of people that are eligible for food stamps but don't take them. If we increased the participation, you would not only be helping those families, but you would be bringing in this influx from an economic perspective, this infusion of monies in the state that could help our economy. And that is true. And it's similar for the optional expansion program under the federal health care reform, where the feds are currently paying 100% of the cost of this new population. So in that case, it's like you get benefits to the individuals who have the health care, and the federal government's paying for it. Now, you may be concerned as a federal taxpayer, but from the state's perspective, obviously you have an interest to bring those dollars in. We've done health provider taxes, where we've leveraged more federal funds, so we've done that before. And something that our office has raised for many years, and don't get too excited about it initially, about raising community college fees. The federal government provides tax credits of about 100% of the first $2,000 in cost. And we've often argued, well, if you raise tuition up to that level, the families are not hurt because they can offset that entirely with their tax credits, but you have an infusion of new monies in the community colleges. And you increase your federal dollars. People don't like the sort of sticker shock of, well, we're raising tuition. So I know that's not necessarily a popular approach. But if you wanted to maximize your federal dollars and minimize the effect on individuals, that would be one option that you could consider. And finally, just what some are issues to watch. Well, when you take federal dollars, obviously they come with restrictions. And that's something that states rightly should always take into account. There should be a tension between states and the federal government. And so you just have to be aware that when they give you money, they're going to, in many cases, tell you how to spend it. And that may differ from how you want to spend it. So you should be careful. And the other thing, of course, is that federal commitments can change. And I think the health care, we're obviously in a situation where there's lots of tension at the federal level. They've said they're going to pay 90% of our expansion population. With the federal budget in the situation it's in, well, there's no guarantee that they'll do that. They said that they were going to provide for our CHIPS, our Healthy Families Program, health care, that they were going to increase the percentage to 85%. Well, it's not clear they're going to do that. So it's just a caution that you have to be careful about both those things. And then I just threw in there federal tax reform, because clearly if the feds do tax reform, that can affect our tax system. It could affect the distribution of how we make tax payments. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll either kick it to Mr. Nicholsberg or back to you.
Why don't we do that? That way I know I have questions. You've raised some good points that I'd like to ask some questions. I'm sure other members do as well. But in the interest of keeping the agenda moving, we'll introduce Mr. Nicholsberg, who UCLA Anderson forecast. I want you to know that I had a professor from USC called me and asked why we had invited a UCLA economist and not a USC, and I kind of froze there for a minute. But welcome to the state legislature. Doctor, we want to give you the floor, and before I do that, I want to introduce you. You are the senior economist at UCLA Anderson Forecast. You joined UCLA's Anderson School of Management in 2006, where you also teach economics in the MBA program. At the Anderson School Forecast, he plays a role in the economic modeling and forecasting of the national, state, and California economies. Dr. Nicholsberg, begin if you're ready.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. The next time that you get that question, the response is, I was formerly on the faculty of USC, so you're getting both.
So it's not because you beat USC in a football game in the last 2 or 3 years, right?
No. It's because you wanted to get both.
There you go.
Both in one, 2 in 1.
There you go, 2 for 1.
So what I'd like to do is, and I thank you for this opportunity, is talk about some high-level things in California. And as Mac Taylor said, California is a very large economy, has been growing. It is a wealthy economy. In fact, in that first chart that he showed, if you converted those top 10 into per capita, we move up. So in many ways, we're doing very well. But I think this committee is looking at ways to do better, particularly for those parts of California that are in what we call the bifurcated economy, that are not doing so well. And so I want to focus in terms of the depth of my remarks on manufacturing and construction, because some sort of interesting and problematic things are going on there, and that's why you see the picture of the Tesla factory on that first slide. And the one thing that immediately strikes you is that's a factory building automobiles, so we have great hopes for expansion, but you don't see any people in that picture. So the roadmap talk about goods movement, housing, employment, construction, and manufacturing, the implications for the forecast. And first of all, something that's been emphasized this morning, imports and exports are important for California. And we talk about exports because that's exports of California manufactured goods, and that's jobs at the ports. But imports are also crucially important, and we know we have this labor dispute which is going on now, but those imports support a large logistics industry, because we're the port of entry for the manufacturing and industrial centers of Asia. And in parts of California like Los Angeles and the Inland Empire, parts that have been hurting, the good news is that Americans are buying more now. They're buying more from Asia. It's coming in through our ports, and that will support an expansion in those sectors. Additionally, in international air cargo, and what's kind of interesting is that this is one place where we're seeing an increase in exports in spite of the fact that that many of our trading partners are in relatively bad economic shape. These are the high-value, time-sensitive goods. This is the high-tech manufacturing that California does, and so that's also good news. Tourism is also up in spite of the fact that the dollar is strong. We are at record high levels of international arrivals at LAX, which is the principal port of entry for tourists, both from Europe and Asia, coming into California, if California is their first stop. And a big increase in Chinese tourists shopping for housing in Southern California, as well as visiting touristic sites and relatives. And so this is really supporting an expansion in leisure and hospitality. In terms of housing, we've seen housing prices go up. They were going up in double digits last year. It's kind of leveled off, and there was some concern that maybe we're just going back to the same old cycle of boom and bust. But if you look, and I think this works, yeah. If you look there, and you saw this on an earlier chart in Mac Taylor's presentation, housing costs, this is median home price, but whatever price index you use for California gives you the same answer. Housing costs today are what they were in 2004. That's not accounting for inflation. So if you bought a home in 2004, on average, you had a 0 rate of return. Accounting for inflation, you lost money. And so homes are not overpriced based on that metric in California. What is really happening is that we're getting a normalization of markets. And so what you see in this chart on the red line is distressed sales. These are foreclosures as a percentage of total home sales. It's down around 6%. That's really normal. That's what you would expect from people losing their jobs in the normal course of things, from deaths and divorces and all of the things that lead to foreclosures. And that's what we experienced earlier when we had normal housing markets. The blue line is foreclosures plus short sales, and that's down around 11%. And when you compare it to, say, 2003, 2004, those were at 8%. But we have many fewer houses on the market. So it's a smaller market today. So these are really normal levels of distressed housing. And now the market is normalizing, and these higher prices are bringing houses on the market. That's good news because that creates a demand for new homes, new construction, and construction jobs. And we're going to come back to construction in a moment. I'm going to talk briefly about payroll employment. As Max said, we're at new highs, and we continue to grow. We outperform the U.S. consistently, and we've been in the top 10 since the recovery started. But if you take the trend from 1990 through 2007, we're below that trend, and our forecast has that gap closing. But if we stay on that kind of trend line, it is the end of the decade before it closes. So lots of room to grow in California. But there's some flies in the ointment and ones that I think are worth thinking about. The first is that housing tastes have changed. What you see on this graph is the percentage of new homes, this is permits for new home construction, that are single-family detached homes. And there's only one place where, if you're looking over on the left, where it drops to 50-50. And that was in the late 1980s when there were tax incentives for building apartments that were going to expire. And that was also the halcyon days of the S&L boom. Other than that, we are sort of leaning more towards multifamily housing, single-family housing, except for today. We've dropped now to 50-50. That's been kind of solid. That's not because of tax incentives. And there's a real sense that tastes have changed. So why does that matter? Well, if you take these permits and apply the number of jobs that the National Association of Home Builders says it takes to build a single-family detached and a multifamily unit, you get this kind of employment picture. And that employment picture shows, the bubble and that we're now making steady growth in construction. And construction is a real contributor to new jobs in California now. But if you take that 50-50 ratio and just do a thought experiment and kind of go backwards in time and say, how many jobs would we have had if it had been 50-50 kind of all along? It's a lot less. In fact, we lose about 15% of all of our construction workforce. And going forward, we don't see any real change happening in that 50-50 relationship. We'll get more multifamily housing, but it means that a significant part of an important sector in California is now smaller and will remain so for at least the foreseeable future. And those construction workers who thought they were going to go back to work in this sector are going to have to be doing something different. So that's certainly a jobs issue. Turning now to manufacturing. So this is a kind of old story. Manufacturing, we have continually lost jobs in manufacturing. We've lost about a third of the jobs in manufacturing in California. And when recessions happen, it goes more rapidly, kind of leveling out, even pushing up a little bit in durable goods, which is the top line, and sort of flattening out, but still pushing downward in non-durable goods. A lot of manufacturing jobs gone, and those are certainly middle-class jobs. So I took a look at manufacturing and recovery and employment. So these are counties in California, and across the horizontal is the percentage of employment in manufacturing pre-recession. And the vertical is the percentage of the labor force, percentage of jobs recovered. So above that dark line is fully recovered. And you see there's no correlation there. Manufacturing in terms of employment in California has become much less important, and it's not really the driver of where we're getting recovery. Because if you look at, say, these top three, they're all in the Bay Area. That's San Mateo, Santa Clara, and San Francisco. Very different percentages of employment in manufacturing. We have two others that are up there, Kern, which is energy, of course, and then these two, which are Stanislaus and Merced. And you have to ask, well, why is Merced fully recovered and Stanislaus not? They look a lot alike. One difference is University of California and Merced. That it just so happens that they added enough jobs to turn this thing push this above that dark line. But it wasn't the people working in manufacturing and retail and construction who were getting those jobs. So that's really kind of the jobs issue. And it's not that we bring back manufacturing, because this is manufacturing in California, durable goods output. It's up. Today it's 150% of what it was in 1990. And that's kind of, let's go back to that picture of the Tesla factory. That's because we're producing a lot more with many fewer people. I was speaking with a producer of construction goods, of construction materials, and I asked, so are you using robotics? And what he was doing, the kind of materials he was working with, they were materials that you would expect sort of skilled people to be cutting and fabricating. And he said, oh, yeah, I'm doing 2.5 times the volume and I have half the labor force as I did a decade ago. That's the new California. That's manufacturing. So when we think about bringing manufacturing back, we're bringing it back with robots. And we need the workforce development to have the people who are working in those factories know how to install, maintain, update those robots, not know how to rivet and metal bend as was previously the case. So the implications, we continue to improve. We still have these structural problems, and they are geographically disparate, more pronounced in the inland parts of the state than in the coastal parts of the state, though in Los Angeles and Orange County you see a lot of this. No indications in the data that we're going to kind of move off this trend. The threats to the forecast are really external. They're U.S. or geopolitical, but domestic. But within California, we don't see that. And in particular, firms all throughout the world need to improve productivity in order to grow. And where do they go for their productivity improving equipment and software? Well, disproportionately to California. So that's why we see this really sort of incredible growth of California relative to the rest of the U.S. And finish up with, this is our forecast. I didn't just get tired and lazy and just put 2.2, 2.2, 2.2. That's actually the way it came out. That's faster than what we're projecting for the U.S. And that's expected to drive down that unemployment rate. These are annual averages, but to get down to close to 5% by the end of 2016. So that'll be full employment, but it's over full employment in some places. Our forecast for the Bay Area is in the fours, low fours. And that means that our forecast for, if we did one, for counties in the Central Valley, Inland Empire, in the northern parts of the state is going to be much higher. And so I'll conclude with that. I don't think there are any more slides. Yeah. Conclude with that, and I guess Mac and I are ready for
Doctor, thank
questions.
you. And Mr. Taylor, I'm going to open it up to the committee members for questions. I'll start over here to my left.